Good afternoon and welcome to the 757th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club, recognized as the premier nonpartisan forum in the nation for the discussion of economic, social, and political issues. The club is actually celebrating now our 17th birthday, so we've been around a long time, and we've been lucky enough to host over 1,000 prominent speakers over the course of those many years, with a, I think, great tradition of excellence, which of course continues up to today. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students joining us virtually from Fordham University, the NYU Stern School of Business, Yeshiva University Cy Sims School of Business, and also, in addition to those online, we have some in the room as well from our largest ever class of fellows, the ECNY Fellows Class of 2024. It's a select group of diverse, rising, next-gen business thought leaders. Actually, there are over 80, and we also have a large number now of non-resident fellows who participate virtually. It's an honor for me to be able to welcome our honored guest, Jared Bernstein. Jared serves as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Previously, he served as chief economist to then Vice President Biden in the Obama-Biden administration before joining the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he served as a senior fellow from 2011 to 2021. A former social worker, Jared has a long track record of devising economic policies to expand opportunity for working Americans. Jared's previously served as executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class and as an economic advisor to President Obama. Prior to his service in the Obama-Biden administration, he was a senior economist and director of the Living Standards Program at the Economic Policy Institute and served as deputy chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor under President Clinton. Jared received his bachelor's degree from the Manhattan School of Music, his master of social work degree from Hunter College, and his PhD in social welfare from Columbia University. The format today will begin with opening remarks, and that will be followed by a conversation with Mark Zandi. Mark is the chief economist at Moody Analytics, and we're honored to have him again as moderator. They'll take audience questions from those in the room, and we're going to end closer, as I just mentioned, at 1:10 p.m. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record as we do have media on the line and in the room. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jared to the stage.
Tell me if I have any salad in my teeth. Thank you, Barbara, for that really nice introduction. It is a privilege to be here. I want to thank Molly Opinski, who helped me get here and helps me get to where I need to be. And Mark, it's great to have you here. Mark is a good old friend of mine he's from Philadelphia, and it's nice to be here in New York with the Knicks kicking the 76ers butts. So I'll be reminding you of that a few times during our meeting today. I wanted to take advantage of the privilege of speaking at the Economic Club of New York to pull back a bit, don't worry, not too far, from the daily obsession that many of us share with the everyday data flow. In my conversation with Mark, I'll be sure to share with you CEA's, Council of Economic Advisors, and the administration's near-term economic outlook, but my hope is that you might find it interesting to hear how we in the Biden administration think about some of the big contemporary questions in political economy. Questions like, what is the role of government in a market economy, and how has that role evolved? Economists agree that market failures occur, and when they do, there's a role for government intervention. But what defines a market failure? One perspective on the uptick of current economic policy interventions is that some governments, including our own, are diagnosing more market failures. And if that's true, why? Is there evidence in support of the prescriptions we've put forth to address these failures? I suspect you've heard President Biden inveigh against so-called trickle-down economics in favor of what he calls middle-out, bottom-up economics. This framing introduces the idea of not just market failure, but policy failure, invoking the need to replace a misguided economic policy of the past with a better one, where better, in this case, means better micro and macro outcomes, stronger, steadier growth that is more broadly shared. Our work to accelerate the spotting and correcting of market and policy failures raises some eyebrows, to be sure. A recent New York Times article quoted a deputy chief economist from the World Bank critiquing the pursuit of industrial policies by stating, quote, "There are different ways of shooting yourself in the foot. This is one way of doing it." In a recent speech, Managing Director Georgieva of the IMF argued for caution in this space, warning that, quote, "Some of the measures announced or implemented last year were not always clearly related to market failures." Given the risk of political capture of economic policies, it is a warning to be heeded. Greg Ip of the Wall Street Journal recently wondered, I think reasonably, what's the limiting principle of industrial policy, meaning how and where do policymakers draw the lines between public and private activity? It is thus important to keep the bar high for intervening in market outcomes, but the examples I'm going to share with you handily clear it. In fact, many interventions, especially those in the competition space, correct policy failures that unleash more market forces, like recent action on non-compete clauses in labor contracts, or measures to offset unfair trade practices, which, as the economist Michael Pettis recently pointed out, unleash comparative advantages that were otherwise diminished by manipulated trade and capital flows. Let's start by reflecting on policymakers' response to the pandemic-induced recession. Of course, when GDP craters and unemployment spikes, as was the case in the pandemic-induced recession, we've known since at least Keynes that there's a role for counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary intervention. What's notable here is that policymakers throughout the advanced economies enacted fast and generally effective policies to offset the shock. The policies took different shapes. EU governments did more to keep workers connected to their jobs. We did some of that, but mostly expanded unemployment insurance benefits to the literally tens of millions who were laid off. We also hugely ramped up vaccine distribution, of course. Now, I have a set of figures there, and I'll take you through them as relevant, but as the first figure shows, V-shaped recoveries ensued across the G7. This is real GDP indexed to whatever it's indexed to. As you see, the US was leading the pack, indexed to 100 in Q4. And as you see, V-shaped recoveries ensued with the US quite clearly leading the pack. But let me show you two slides that get more at the uniqueness of the US response, and that's the next page. The first slide on the next page shows how elevated unemployment insurance support how elevated the unemployment insurance, or UI support, was relative to our own history, and it shows how these benefits coincided with a very quick return to full employment. And if you follow the dots on the scatter plot on the left from 2020 to 2021 to 2022, you see how quickly unemployment goes from 9% on the x-axis all the way down to 4%. It's been below 4% for the last 2 years. Now, and of course, the magnitude of benefits on the y-axis is a big outlier. Now, some will reasonably look at that UI slide and shout inflation. And I've long held that the combination of strong demand and constrained supply, amplified by the pandemic-induced shift in consumer preferences from services to goods, led to inflationary pressures. But the slide on the right, which I suggest maybe you haven't seen before, shows that cumulative inflation was actually quite consistent across the G7 economies. Cumulative inflation, which is on the y-axis, is about, you can kind of draw a straight line through a bunch of those countries, and all of which employ different fiscal policies of differing magnitudes. Where the US is an outlier, and it's quite a dramatic outlier, is in real GDP growth, the x-axis. We had similar inflationary outcomes of other G7 economies, but have enjoyed uniquely positive growth. Of course, some of these other countries have been a lot more exposed to the war in Ukraine than we have. Now, these figures tell a cyclical story, but the absence of full employment has, for the last 40 years, been a structural shortfall, as shown in the next figure. So if you turn to the page and look at the figure on the left, it shows that over the first half of post-war history, the U.S. labor market spends 64% of its quarters, almost 2/3 of the time, with the unemployment rate below the CBO's estimate of the natural rate. And that means, 64% of the time was, at or below full employment. Labor markets were uniformly tight in those years. But over the second half of the period, starting in 1980, the United States achieved full employment in less than 40% of the quarters, a potent challenge to the assumption that labor markets naturally settle into full employment conditions. Now, for my many years of working with President Biden, I can tell you that he is acutely aware of the importance of full employment. And the fact that I've focused on this market, quote, I'd say market/policy failure over much of my career is one reason he and I click. The first chapter of the latest economic report of the president that the CEA recently published goes into great detail on the benefits of full employment, particularly distributional benefits, who benefits and how much they do, and the costs of persistent slack, which I'm happy to amplify during the Q&A or discussion with Mark. But as a teaser, I included one slide, and it's the slide on the right in that same page with the full employment tracker there on the left. That slide on the right shows the powerful impact of tight labor markets on racial unemployment gaps. Most recently, racial unemployment gaps, black minus white unemployment, hit their lowest levels on record. And you see a cyclical dynamic in that figure. Extended periods of tight labor market can also lead to reverse hysteresis or improvements in the economy's supply side, for example, by pulling more workers into the labor market who might otherwise be left behind, or by improving other supply side fundamentals, including even productivity. The theory, which has some but not a lot of evidence, is that when full employment labor markets boost labor costs, less efficient firms are forced to discover new efficiencies to maintain their unit labor costs and thereby their profit margins. It's sound logic, and I hope it's true, but the broader punchline here is that labor markets do not necessarily settle into full employment, and the absence of these conditions is starkly counter to our worker-centered agenda. Let me turn to another obvious market failure, and that is inadequate investment to mitigate climate change, which has served as a motivator for our industrial policy, as market forces alone have not yielded sufficient progress on shifting our economy from a fossil fuel-based energy system to one based on cleaner sources of energy. For relatively proven technologies such as solar, IRA-style production tax credit can lower the cost of adoption. Such support is not about picking winners, but rather about sending lasting demand signals that allow private industry to make clean investments. A key principle that CEA has elevated in this context, one that speaks to Greg Ip's question that I mentioned earlier about limiting principles of industrial policy, is that once these technologies achieve cost parity and become cost competitive with existing energy sources, government intervention can dial back. The costs of inaction are already present. Last year saw a record 28 weather and climate-related disasters in the U.S., causing losses of over $1 billion per event, and the probability of lasting damages to human health, food insecurity, social instability rises if we fail to meet our climate targets. But there's also enormous upside to this transition. By targeting clean energy resources, our economy could unlock lower energy prices, greater energy security, create new industrial sectors centered around innovation and production of new energy technologies. With an upbeat investment tempo that has surprised many of us, targeted support for clean energy technology is clearly pulling in significant private investment. Since President Biden took office, private firms have announced more than $500 billion in new manufacturing facilities in the United States, including in solar, wind, batteries, and electric vehicles. Now let's turn to trade policy, where the intellectual evolution among some economists has been, I think, particularly nuanced. Summarizing broadly, Trade and political economists have historically viewed expanded trade flows and their corresponding capital flows as unequivocally positive as they lowered consumer costs, expanded the economy's supply side, extended the reach and depth of financial markets, and, if you listen to the rhetoric around 2000 prior to China's accession to the WTO, even inculcated democratic values. Now, there's solid evidence for some of these claims, but they overlook distortions that I learned about back at the back at the Economic Policy Institute in the early 1990s, when we were perennial skunks at garden parties warning about what came to be called the China shock. While recognizing the benefits of expanded trade, we also saw that some of our trading partners, most notably China, had persistent surpluses that stemmed from management of both currency values and their consumer spending share of GDP, a key variable that had long been suppressed. Anyone willing to look at these dynamics quickly saw that the old textbook identity-based explanation for trade deficits, profligate countries undersaving relative to their production and consumption, was insufficient to understand what was happening to global trade. We now know that if a trading partner suppresses their own internal consumption, then exports their excess savings and excess capacity our way, such unchecked flows can wreak havoc ranging from financial bubbles, see Ben Bernanke's global savings glut work circa 2005, to the hollowing out of high value added jobs in communities exposed to these forces. Ignoring warnings back then has turned out to be costly to Americans. Communities lost crucial anchoring businesses, often in manufacturing. When they complained about the impact of globalization, they were met with woefully insufficient offsets, and perhaps even worse, a promise from political and policy elites that the next trade agreement was going to work out much better for them than the last one had. We're still very much in the throes of the economic and political fallout from those days. In the context of my comments today, we know that trade generates both positive and negative externalities, invoking a role for government to boost the former and dampen the latter. We at CEA have worked hard to elevate this both and perspective, balancing both trade's benefits and costs when considering policy. Most recently, you see these dynamics in play in discussions that Treasury Secretary Yellen had with her Chinese counterparties during her recent visit. Based on the industrial policy rationale described above, the risk that China could manufacture and export excess capacity of heavily subsidized goods into sectors like EVs and clean energy, upending our domestic investment plans, must be viewed as a risk of China shock part 2. Yes, people are consumers who benefit from positive terms of trade, and domestic businesses benefit and grow more quickly than they would otherwise due to a deeper supply of intermediate inputs. There's even evidence that more trade boosts the productivity of domestic firms who face broader competition. These are all benefits of trade that we will continue to pursue. But people aren't only consumers. They're also workers who seek not just incomes but dignity from their jobs. I like to think that economists have moved beyond the simplistic assumption that all you needed to know about trade flows is that they lower costs. Finally, and partly in honor of Mark, I will discuss a market failure that looms particularly large in both the Biden administration and the public's thinking right now, the long-term shortfall in affordable housing. It is a shortage that evolved over the last 2 decades, and by tracking the extent to which supply has failed to keep up with household formation, we estimate its magnitude to be north of 2 million. As a result, the figure on the last page, the figure on the left on the last page, shows that 45% of renters are now cost burdened, meaning that they spend 30% or more of their family income on rent, more than twice the share who were cost burdened in 1960. As you see, this problem has been growing for a while now, but more recently it has been exacerbated by a lock-in problem, a cause of which is seen in the figure on the right. This one shows the effective mortgage rate, the average of outstanding mortgages, against the rate of a new mortgage. That spread at the end of the figure, which I think we circled, is at a 40-year high. And it means people who'd like to move are locked in to their lower mortgage. That dynamic, in turn, is significantly reducing housing market churn and making the first rung of the ladder unreachable for too many families. Part of this market failure stems from the fact that housing markets are partially regulated by local governments that understandably consider the preferences of resident homeowners and developers, both of whom prefer higher land values. And it's true that land use and zoning can be a reasonable part of community planning, separating industrial areas from schools and residential areas, for example. But they can also reflect historical racial exclusion, and they can lead to overly tight restrictions on where and how we can build housing. In that sense, they've surely contributed to the supply shortfall. Now, Mark and our friend and housing expert Jim Parrott often reflect on scarce land as part of the, quote, pencil out problem, a related market failure in this space. The problem is that given the costs they face, too often it doesn't make economic sense for housing developers to build affordable housing. In response, we've developed ambitious plans which we believe would support the creation of 2 million units of affordable housing. Part of the plan is direct subsidization of affordable unit construction through programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, and the Homes Renovation Project. LIHTC has funded 20% of all new multifamily units since the late 1980s, creating more than 3.5 million affordable units. It has the unique advantage of being favored by builders, bankers, and low-income housing advocates, making it a strong candidate for bipartisan support. We also propose a new neighborhood homes tax credit to support building or renovating affordable homes. This credit hits the, quote, pencil out problem by covering the gap between the cost and the cost of construction and the sale price. To try to nudge open some zoning restrictions, we offer bidders a higher ranking on infrastructure and other supports if their application includes a plan to push back on exclusionary land use. And we're continuing to look for ways to advance the production, the preservation of accessory dwelling units and manufactured homes. I can tell you with 100% confidence that President Biden considers building more affordable housing one of the most important pieces of unfinished business in our economic agenda, and one we won't stop fighting for until we close that gap between household formation and available affordable housing. I hope I've given you a sense of the worker, family, and community-centered lens through which we view market and policy failures and the role of government in addressing them. Thus far, the track record looks positive in terms of hitting and staying at full employment, helping to stand up critical domestic industries to fight climate change and ensure more resilient supply chains, pushing back on the exporting of excess capacity to some of those key industries, and deriving a robust agenda to increase the supply of affordable housing. Our work is far from done. No victory laps here, and there's more unfinished business besides the housing shortage, including an equally important shortage of affordable childcare. But as I've explained and as I've emphasized, in many of the areas in which we're intervening, we see welcome evidence of middle-out, bottom-up growth on behalf of working Americans. With that, let me turn to Mark for our chat, and then I look forward to your questions.
Well, it's good to be with you, Jared, and I want to thank you. Great speech.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Economic Club of New York and Barbara for the opportunity to be here. A little surprised you invited me back after Lael Brainerd, but thank you. I want to do three things.
Well, first of all, you should listen to the guy with the tie.
I was looking around to see if I was alone.
No, you're not alone.
I'm not alone. I was not alone. I want to do three things in our conversation. We've got about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll turn it back to the group. First, I want to talk about your speech, a few questions about that. Then I want to quickly turn to current economic conditions and the outlook, because obviously a lot of things top of mind there. And then maybe we can venture into the election a little bit, talk about economic policy. We'll see how that goes.
Certainly I can talk about economic policy.
Yeah, okay, very good. Okay, on the speech, industrial policy, kind of a dirty word, or at least it has been a dirty word. It's been applied to the policies that the administration has passed. And, clearly a very fulsome legislative agenda from the American Recovery Act to the infrastructure legislation, CHIPS, IRA, a lot of stuff.
ARP, the rescue plan.
The rescue plan. The rescue plan.
Obama.
Yeah, so I'm going all the way back to 2008. The rescue plan. Do you consider the words industrial policy as a criticism or?
Not at all, not at all. I mean, sometimes we call it industrial strategy to get away from that, but I think they're synonyms. No, not at all. And in fact, the insight that I would like to share with you, and the reason why I think that, is that I believe we've been, and I think I have great evidence, that we've been doing industrial policy since this was a country. Obviously, anyone who has looked back at the early days of this country know the famous, before he was a rap artist, Hamilton's annual survey of manufacturers, which is a very intentional industrial policy. I mean, I think there's a fair argument that embryonic industrial policy is different than a more mature economy. But I think more to the point, the thing that always got under my skin is that industrial policy in this country, or favoring some sectors over the others, has been an integral part of our tax code ever since we've had a tax code. And the way that industrial policy played out or was derived was whoever had the best connected lobbyists got the best industrial policy, or the most goodies out of the tax code. And that is not a thoughtful type of industrial policy, and I think it's given rise to some pretty significant distortions in sectoral imbalances in our economy. So we've always had industrial policy, we always will, every country does. I think the difference is not whether you have it or not, it's whether it's thoughtful or not. And the rationales which I gave in my talk, which you can agree with or disagree with, was an effort to show how we think about that.
Yeah, when I think about your policy, the policies that have been passed in the administration, I don't think of them as industrial policy. Like for the Recovery Act and the infrastructure, I just view that as straight up fiscal policy. The economy's in trouble. Yep. You may debate the size of the plan, the elements of the plan, but the economy was obviously still struggling because of the pandemic, trying to get out. The infrastructure, that's straight up fiscal policy. I mean, that's what the federal government's all about, is helping with that. Mm-hmm. The CHIPS Act and the IRA, I tend to think of them as national. There's industrial policy aspects to it, but it's also national security. And for example, the CHIPS Act, that's about bringing semiconductor. There's a lot of things in there, but a big part of that is bringing semiconductor production back into the United States. And we could see the need for that in the context of the pandemic, our exposure to Taiwan, because all the chips are produced in Taiwan, and obviously in the context of the tensions with China and the impacts that has on the ability of Taiwan to produce those chips and get them to the rest of the world. In IRA, the same deal. It's climate change, yes, but it's also getting off of oil and reducing our exposure to, because it's a global market and prices are set globally, to other producers like Saudi Arabia. So I'm surprised that I haven't heard that kind of perspective with regard to trying to explain the logic behind it.
Let me speak to that. So the intersection in the Venn diagram between industrial policy and national security is there. It's a notable intersection. But I think, let's not get, I want to try to avoid getting too hung up on rhetoric. So it seems unquestionably true that when you write a check for extended unemployment insurance benefits, that's countercyclical policy, not industrial policy. But there are parts of the American Rescue Plan, there are parts of the Rescue Plan, that very much favored the purchasing of, say, clean energy, heat pumps, and a program to make it less expensive temporarily, so counter-cyclical policy. Make it less expensive for you to put solar panels on your roof, so people who do that have jobs in a downturn. So there's even an intersection there. I kind of take your point on the bipartisan infrastructure law, because that's public goods. But a big chunk of the public infrastructure law is to build charging stations across the nation. Well, you can't really have an effective EV sector and address range anxiety without that. So that seems, again, an intersection. I think more what you're pointing out are intersections. Now, when you talk about CHIPS and IRA, here we're talking about direct tax subsidies that aim to stand up
a much bigger presence in a particular industry. And that's typically, I think, a pretty good definition of industrial policy. I think, rather than, to me anyway, and, we may just see this differently, the question is not so much is that industrial strategy or policy, but is it wise? Are you picking winners in a way that has, problematic outcomes? And then, again, the speech was designed to address that potential critique.
Got it. Let's turn to one aspect of the market failures you described, and that's housing. That's just for me kind of an area where I focus. And you mentioned Jim Parrott.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of work in this area, and you call out, I think, appropriately, policies that are focused on increasing supply.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, we've got a shortage. Prices are high. Rents are high. We need more supply. LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, neighborhood tax credit, home, which is block grants to state and local governments, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it feels like, and correct me if you feel differently, but it feels like at the end of the day, the real issue here is local government, mostly local government. They're setting zoning and permitting rules that make it very difficult to build, particularly high density in places where the housing is needed. That's a tough one, right? I mean, how do you address that? What do you do?
It was a tough one. Well, first of all, let me just say that a lot of what I learned about this, I learned from you and Jim.
No, you're fine.
And
we're all wrong.
Well, if I'm wrong, then you're wrong. The contribution you two have made to this sector is really notable, really important, and frankly inspiring. So I mentioned I blew by this in the speech, and I was trying to keep the timing manageable. But one of the things that we've been doing, which is small, but I'm kind of in the camp where anything at the margin helps. If you can do something that helps at the margin, you should do it, and then you can try to maybe build on those margins. And this is an example of that. So what do we do in the government? I mean, one of the things we do is we support projects, bipartisan infrastructure law, with grants, with loans. What if we made a connection to some of the projects that we're supporting? Well, a lot of people bid for them. We can't always reward every bid. How about if we give you a higher score in your bid, better chance of getting your bid, if you're doing something to push back on exclusionary zoning? I mean, somebody offered this up at a meeting we had in the White House, and I was like, ding, 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 like that really made sense to me. And so we're starting to do that. And one example, and I think I have maybe 10 examples now, which is tiny, but that's the start. One example is I think it was a train station, a transportation depot in I believe it was in Minneapolis, where they got their bid in part by saying, well, we're going to build affordable housing near this train station, even though it's not zoned for that. We're going to push through that. And I actually think we have a long list in the chapter on this in the economic report of the president of localities that are trying to do precisely what you said in terms of pushing back on land use restrictions. I live in Alexandria. We just had a vote about this to allow plots for single family homes to have at least duplexes. It passed, which I was, pleasantly surprised by. I actually think that's going to end up being sort of a higher end part of the market, but it's a move in the right direction. So I think that the fact that this redounds to the local sector and New York State just passed a budget with, I think, some ambitious plans in terms of creating more affordable housing. So I think that that's, part of the answer is localities doing more. And I see some of that happening. I actually feel a little bit upbeat about it. But I wouldn't discount, and I know you wouldn't either, the federal government's role. I mean, LIHTC, I gave you the numbers in the talk, 3.5 million affordable units, and builders like it, banks like it because they buy the credits from the builders and it lowers their tax liability, and low-income housing advocates like it. So there is bipartisan support for LIHTC. I mean, people may not know this, but that tax bill that was, that passed the House, this tax bill passed the House. This was for, on one side, it was tax credits for research and development, business tax credits. On the other side, it was a child tax credit, which is very important to us. It also had 2,000 units of LIHTC in it. Now it got stuck in the Senate, but there was, that got out of the House with LIHTC in it.
Okay, let's turn to economic the economy's performance in the near-term outlook. And by the way, really cool charts. Really, really good
I
charts.
got way
I'm
more.
a connoisseur of
There's a
charts.
lot more we're
And
listening.
that's pretty cool. Particularly like that scatter plot with the countries and inflation vis-a-vis.
Remember that something?
That's
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
eye-opening.
That's an Ernie Tedeschi chart for the record, but
Yeah, he's good at charts. Yeah.
he's okay.
Okay, I'm not gonna let you off the hook here. I'm gonna ask, about inflation, what was wrong. But before we do that, let me butter you up a little bit and let's talk about what's gone right. And that's the job market. I mean, it's like, I've been at this for 35, 40 years.
Stop.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So what's going on other than policy? But I mean, policy, you can take credit, but what's going on in the labor market, do you think that?
Okay, well, so let's talk about both, because we got to talk about inflation, and I do not shy from that one bit. So let's first talk about what you alluded to, and I'm going to bring inflation into this. So I think this is one of the more remarkable periods of macroeconomics that I've lived through, which is that we have had, depending on the measure that you look at, 5.5, 6 points of disinflation. Take the CPI, it peaked at 9.1%, last seen at 3.5%. All that disinflation has occurred while giving up almost nothing on the unemployment rate. There's been some cooling in the labor market and vacancies, but basically this idea of a sacrifice ratio, which is a very solid concept in macroeconomics that says you can't get the disinflation you need in a situation like this without giving up major points on the demand side or higher unemployment. And in fact, the sacrifice ratio quantitatively is the number of points of unemployment you have to give up to get lower inflation. That ratio has been about 0. So first point is, yes, it's been pretty remarkable. Now, I actually think there's a hint in that scatter plot to the answer to your question, what's happening. I take a close shave with Occam's razor on this one. The US is a 70% consumer spending economy. Okay, Europe is 55%, China is 45%. And I talked a little bit about consumption suppression. The fact is that when the American consumer is economically healthy, either because she has fiscal and monetary support, or as the excess savings from that period, which you've documented, burned off, the labor market came up behind, and we've now had real earnings gains, that is wage growth beating price growth for 13 months in a row, year over year, for middle wage workers. That's been a bit of a baton handoff from savings to earnings. Strong job growth in tandem with real wage gains and a 70% consumer economy equals a steady, stable growth trend. So I think that's, at first blush, a pretty straightforward explanation.
Okay, now the blemish, inflation.
Right.
So core consumer expenditure deflator inflation, which is the measure the Fed targets, is traveling just south of 3%. Of course, the target is 2%. And felt like last year we were making a lot of progress here, was that inflation number coming in very gracefully. Hit early 2024, first quarter, not so much.
Right.
In fact, it backed up. I think annualized core PCE was up 3.7% annualized. That's not good. And of course, it's created a lot of changes in expectations around the conduct of monetary policy, interest rates, that kind of thing, and what's going on in financial markets. So the key kind of critical question here is what's going on? Why did inflation kind of stall? The disinflation kind of stall out here, and how do you feel about things going forward here with regard to inflation?
I think the disinflation in the second half of 23 is largely explained by unsnarling of supply chains, improvement in that part of the economy that delivered that inflation in the first place. As I've mentioned, demand was strong, in part with fiscal and monetary support, but it was the collision of demand and constrained supply, particularly as consumer preferences shifted towards manufacturing goods. So we have some normalization of forces that were very much associated with the pandemic that got us a lot of disinflation. The goods share is still elevated. The goods share of consumer spending is still somewhat elevated relative to pre-pandemic, but it's been coming down. And most importantly, the indexes of supply chains, the New York Fed tracks one, are back down to where they were pre-pandemic. We found in work that we did at CEA that 80+% of the disinflation through the fourth quarter of last year was due to either supply on its own or supply interacted with demand. So that explains the lion's share of what we had. That leaves us with the question of what happened in Q1, where disinflation decelerated. We have less disinflation in Q1 than we had in the second half. To me, it looks like a combination. This question is still unanswered. And, the Fed is scratching its head, so we're still scratching ours. You might even be scratching yours. It looks to us like a combination of top down and bottom up. I think the punchline, I said this in an article in the Times yesterday about this, is that and interestingly, Goldman Sachs has been doing a very nice job of tracking this at a very granular level. They said the same thing in a report from yesterday, a paper by David Miracle, who's one of their chief economists there, that the forces that were driving the disinflation, this normalizing of things that drove up inflation in the first place, look to us like they're still in play. They haven't gone away. They've been temporarily suppressed in Q1, in part due to, as I said, I think a pretty strong economy from the top down, which you and I just talked about, and a set of anomalous components from the bottom up. Starting with those, I mean, the classic example is auto insurance, and the CPI went up 22% year over year. That's not going to stick. I feel quite confident. Medical services, there's a technical thing that we wrote a blog about if you want to see it. CEA does have a blog. How many people here have read the CEA blog?
It's quite good.
One. Wow, man, that's Molly. Oh, was that you who read it? Okay. So please read the CEA blog. We have a piece on the medical services contribution to the CPI. It doesn't have much to do with actual out-of-pocket spending. So at any rate, housing, we all think, and I defer to you on this, if you disagree with this, tell me so, and I'll change my view. I think we all think that the shelter component of the CPI is going to roll over as market rents have rolled over, at least in terms of the rate of inflation. So we think that those will come back to life. The top-down part is, look, we need to see demand has cooled. We've seen cooling demand in the labor market. It remains very strong, but the vacancies have come down, and that's very clear, especially if you look at the vacancy data. The vacancies have come down, so we've seen some cooling there. And most importantly, nominal wage growth has decelerated. Nominal wage growth has kind of slid down, and that should help in that regard as well. So as long as the top down continues to gradually cool, the bottom up, the sort of anomalous categories kind of go back to where they were with regression to the mean that I think will occur, then I think we should get back to something like we were seeing in the second half of last year.
Okay, so no hair on fire here. Just hold on, it's coming. We'll continue to see disinflation here. Okay. When I talk to a lot of different groups around the country, the one thing that often comes up is deficits and debt. And the argument is that it's the high deficits and debt that's powering the economy's growth. It has nothing to do with anything else other than that.
Yeah, I don't think that's, I think that's quite easily disproved. And the best way to do that is to look at fiscal impulse. So fiscal impulse is this economic concept that answers that question. It's how much fiscal policy is contributing to GDP growth. It's most easily understood as not the level of your deficit, but the change in your deficit, actually your primary deficit. So your deficit after you take out the interest rate payments, which don't really play that much of a role here. And so the Brookings Institute, the Hutchins Center at the Brookings Institute, keeps a very nice up-to-date quarter-by-quarter series of fiscal impulse. It was through the roof during the pandemic recession with lots of support from fiscal policy, as we've talked about. And it went very negative after that. And that's often the pattern when you see counter-cyclical responses. Fiscal impulse goes way up, and then it reverses. And now it's neutral. Now, I guess you could argue that, well, neutral's too much. It should be negative. But I think that at least as long as fiscal impulse is neutral, we've looked at this very carefully, it's just not contributing very much to GDP growth right now.
Okay, very good. That's the same answer I give, by the way. Yeah,
there you go.
That Brookings, they have a nice chart that shows quarter by, and they break it down federal, state, and local.
They do.
Yeah,
they do.
so that's very good. Oh, did they? Yeah. Okay, one last question. I'm going to turn it to the audience, to the group. And here I might get a little too close to the sun, but you can tell me if I'm getting too close to the sun. And this is about economic policy on the other side of the election. And I bring this up in the context of a article in the Wall Street Journal last week around Fed independence. I don't know, I'm sure most of you read it. I nearly choked when I read it. About there's some conversations about how to, in my words, rein in, capture the Federal Reserve. So I don't know how you want to handle that or how you want to talk about that, but what do you think?
Well, here's what I can say.
Okay.
If you think about a policy agenda that's focused on mass deportation, on devaluing the dollar, and on taking tariffs up to sky-high rates, most economists, and I bet you almost everybody in this room, would say that sounds like an inflationary agenda. But if you have the Federal Reserve in the background, at least you know there's a potential institutional offset to that inflationary agenda. If you then cut the knees out from the Federal Reserve, I think that is a very scary proposition. So that's what I'll say about that.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Excellent. Okay. Let me turn it back to the group, to the audience. I think Fred, you wanted to ask a question? Yeah.
And there was somebody who during the reception wanted to ask a question about fiscal debt. So I said we'd get to that person. So, but first, Fred.
Sure. So Fred Hoffman.
I know who you are.
Just for that, how do we balance
sort of jobs and employment and worker centered and consumers when we're trying to come up with economic policy? Because there's, on both sides, there are people who feel we should do more for labor. There are others that feel we've drifted too far from worrying about consumers. And so how are you threading that needle?
Yeah.
And then if you add in national security, it becomes even more complicated.
Fred, I think one of the problems we get into in economics, and I came up with the same, training that you did, back in the Stone Age, nothing personal, and is that we're taught like people, there's this consumer section and there's this worker section. They're the same people. Workers are consumers, consumers are workers. Even if they live in a household where somebody doesn't necessarily do labor market production, they're doing, home production. So I think we get into trouble when we split apart workers and consumers and think that there's some sort of competitive policies there. As you've heard from my comments, and I hope you know from my work in this area, when you have a full employment labor market, a lot of those problems get solved, as I answered to Mark, especially when you have a high percentage consumer spending economy like we do, 70% of nominal GDP. Having a strong labor market means having a strong consumer, having strong counter-cyclical policy in downturns means having a strong consumer, having a strong industrial policy that creates value-added jobs means having strong employment and strong consumers. So I can tell you that in the mind of President Biden, that is a false dichotomy. I think where it has more relevance is in the trade space, which you've written about and which I tried to speak to here. And there the idea is that we need to be mindful that people are both consumers and workers, so that if something helps consumers and hurts workers, we probably shouldn't do it. But there's ways, and I've spoken extensively about this. If you want to go on the CE website and see some of my speeches, I've given 2 speeches on this exact topic, this both and trade policy, ramping up the benefits to consumers from trade while maintaining a worker-centered policy framework.
Who's the person who asked the question in the?
Well, I remember it if you don't, but anyway, no, somebody asked the question. I think somebody, I don't actually see him here anymore. Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
Right here. Thank you for coming today, Jeff Hool. What is your view about the national debt? In particular, the national debt at the current elevated interest levels, the interest payment on that debt as a percentage of GDP, I'm told it'll eclipse all other line items except entitlements. And what does that mean for our nation and future generations?
I think we have to be mindful that lines that just go straight up forever are unsustainable. And I think that's just common sense. I think about this very much in near term and longer term perspectives. I think over the near term, again, it was Louis Shiner from Brookings did a very nice piece on this recently. I think over the near term, we can handily finance the debt that we have, even at higher interest rates. A good way to look at that is, how are Treasury auctions going, and look at bid-ask spreads. And I think we still, by dint of our unique economic position in the world, our reserve currency, we can still finance our debt. In fact, one of the things we look at is the debt service, not debt to GDP, but debt service as a share of GDP. And that's well within historical realms. Historically, that stayed between 1% and 2%, and that's where it is now. So we can finance our current debt in ways that don't look economically stressful to me. But if we don't do something in the long term about the structural imbalance between receipts and outlays, we're going to have, I think, a lot of problems. And that's why, in our budget, the president has $3 trillion of deficit reduction. And so it's not that simple. I mean, it's not that complicated. This is arithmetic. And so we have, quite significant revenue enhancements, higher taxes above 400,000. And one of the problems there is that we have some very wealthy people in this country who pay a very low effective tax rate. So President Biden calls this, investing more fairness into the tax code. We fund the IRS so that they can close the literally hundreds of billion, $500–600 billion tax gap between what people what people owe and what they pay. So that's tax evasion. And that's very much concentrated at the top of the scale. So that helps close that gap. And that's our budget. And then, of course, we cut costs. It's not just tax rate. We cut costs, especially in healthcare. In fact, some of that you've seen: insulin costs, prescription drug costs. I mean, that's a winner for both inflation and the budget. So I don't think it's that complicated. We have a plan to get there. We need Congress to work with us. Look, when one half of Congress, or however, whatever the ratio is, says, I will never, ever raise a tax, we can't get there from here. So there has to be compromise.
How are we doing on time, Barbara?
We have a few more minutes.
Few more minutes, good.
Let's go, my friend
Yeah,
Alan.
yeah. Mhm.
Jared, thank you for all. It's been great. And we talked a long time ago, for a long time, about the income inequality aspect of what you've been addressing. And I think a lot of your policies are going in the right direction on that. But another thing we've talked about in the past, and it follows on in a bunch of ways, but even on the deficit and stuff, is demographics. In that we have such a big decline in working age population as a percentage of our population. The primary way we tax people is through their earnings. If you look at all of our measures of taxation.
Sorry.
And,
I just have go ahead.
yep. And at the same time, we have a global economy where every major economy has declining working age populations. So how do we think about that? There's a lot of aspects, but just on the part, I believe in your new budget, you have some, going after people of higher, paying more for the Social Security, et cetera. But once you've retired, you're not paying. And so how do we think about the burden, not just on rich versus poor, but old versus young, of paying for the deficits that we've already run up before we got old? And one question on that just is that I think every other OECD country has a VAT or some form of consumption. And is there any thought about that as one of the ways that if I'm wealthy and retired, I will consume more? And is that one way to look at taxation?
I don't think I've ever gone to a tax meeting where the question of a VAT hasn't come up. So it is a well understood alternative. Oh, look, President Biden has been unequivocal and said this hundreds, if not thousands of times. He's not going to raise taxes on anybody under 400,000. That is a view that he has espoused since he was running for office, and it is a line he will not cross. I think the budget gives you our answer to that question. It may not be as fulsome as your question suggested in terms of going into different areas and going into different parts of the income scale where we're not going to go. But I think when you propose literally trillions of dollars of deficit reduction, and adding, fairness into the tax code by going after high-end tax evaders. For every dollar you fund the IRS, I think you claw back something like 10 or 12. I mean, that is, and if you're against that, you're for tax evasion. I mean, I know this is, I'm not saying that as a partisan, I'm saying that as a very simple statement of fact. I would actually call the fact underfunding the IRS is a shadow tax cut for tax evaders. I mean, that's true. I'll argue that all day. And so where we start is a good starting place. It may not be a finishing place, but it's a good starting place. And I think the idea would be to work with Congress, which Biden has consistently shown he can pull rabbits out of hats, and achieve the deficit savings that we've written down in the budget.
One last question.
Okay.
Thank you for this thoughtful conversation. I wanted to see if you would, especially from two chart nerds, which was also very interesting. I wanted to ask if you would get a little bit more specific in your predictions for the rest of the calendar year as to the inflation rate, how quickly it may go down more, and interest rates, and how and when and how often we might see interest rates coming down.
Well, one of the things that is unique about my position is that Mark can make a forecast and get it wrong, and I might bug him, but he's not going to get slammed all over the newspapers, and every time he goes on TV, say, you were wrong, whereas that'll happen to me. So let me just say, and so that's not, I don't want to be completely evasive, and in fact, I'll be forthcoming in the following sense. We have a forecast. It's public. You can go see it. So in the budget, maybe this isn't the forecast that people go and look at all the time, because it's quite late relative to market forecasts. It's a little stale. But you can look at our budget and look at the economic assumptions. And CEA, working with Treasury and OMB, comes up with a 10-year forecast where we forecast inflation and interest rates, and you can go see what they say. When it comes to the next year, I would just cite the market shops that I follow and Mark's work, which I follow closely, and he's got a great, as good a track record as anybody, I think. And the idea is very consistent with what I said before about deflation returning, maybe not back at the same pace we saw in the second half of last year, but that the road back to the target, should get underway in the remaining quarters of this year. And it will be bumpy and nonlinear. So I saw, Goldman, for example, I think it was this morning or yesterday, was talking about core PCE. So this is not my forecast, this is theirs, talking about core PCE at the end of this year being, well north of target, but between 2 and 3, maybe it was 2.5 or
2.6.
2.6, okay. And that by the end of 25, by the end of 25, being closer to target, I think they had 2.1. And so I follow them, and I think they do a good job. And you can look at them for prediction of cuts. And that's something I wouldn't say, because that gets into a granular commentary on Fed policy that we don't do, because, in reference to my earlier comment, we respect Fed independence.
So the trick is to forecast often. No, that's the trick. Yeah, forecast often. And let me say, before I turn it back to Barbara, I had never heard this before, but this is a great phrase, close shave with Occam's razor. That's so cool. That is so cool. Yeah. Thank you. Wow. Yeah.
That was terrific, and it was a real honor to have you here today, and it was fun too. So we've had we do have many additional speakers that ahead for the spring calendar. I'm going to zip through those really quickly, because I know everybody's getting hungry that's here, and if you're virtual, you probably have other things you want to get to too. On Thursday, May 2nd, we will host the founder and president of History Makers, Juliana Richardson, for a webinar. We have Gary Kasparov for a luncheon on May the 6th. We have Dr. Ed Yardini for a webinar on May the 21st. And our very own chair, John Williams, the head of the New York Fed, will be speaking at a luncheon on May 30th. We have Glenn Hubbard and Larry Summers joining us remotely June the 4th, again, by popular demand. Strauss Zelnick, the chair and CEO of Take Two Interactive, the gaming company, will be here June the 17th. And then Lisa Cook will come back to visit us again from the Federal Reserve June the 25th. As the presidential elections approach, we'll be inviting both the major party candidates after the conventions to also address the club separately, of course. And there are some other great speakers that I'm not going to announce yet that we're in the middle of confirming. So keep track of our website, please. We try to keep it current so you can watch for those dates. And as always, I'd like to take a minute to thank those of our 375 members of the Centennial Society joining us today for their contributions, because they represent the financial backbone of the club and make our programming possible. So thank you all for attending today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And for those in the room, please enjoy your lunch. Those digital, we'll see you soon, I hope. Thank you.